Right. So, to get started, I want to start by saying thank you to Peter for the chance to come and speak, and Raquel as well. Yeah, I'm hoping that this talk and some of the slides will be a kickstart to a good conversation about it. Because I think one of the reasons it's a really interesting topic is because it's something we all have personal experience with, both trying to organize things and also taking part in things. So it's something where what we've seen in the work we've done is that best practice is ultimately going to come from all of those experiences within astronomy, but also in other fields as well. So I think that's why it's such an interesting cross-disciplinary experience. But to get started, so what I'm going to focus on today is the how and why, actually the other way around, so the why and then the how, but looking specifically at hybrid interaction as well as the broader context it fits into, which is how do we make online interaction better? And to start with, just like kind of like a provocative thought, as it were, is that I think one of the key things going out of whatever we're in, like, the pandemic's not over, it's endemic, we're just in this weird transition disruptive period. One of the things that's super clear is that we can actually do better and we can improve the ways that we used to do the things we were doing before. But it just starts with saying, okay, let's improve things. Let's take the best out of the last couple of years. Let's get rid of the worst and sort of come to a better place. So that's one of the, I guess, key messages that hopefully we can take away and discuss later. So for context, following on from what Peter said, I'm based at CSIRO, which is Australia's National Science Agency, and I'm in the part of CSIRO that focuses on space and astronomy. I have a number of roles. One of my main roles is overseeing the science operations for ASCAP. I also coordinate the duty astronomers, so these are people who help support the compact array. I am a deputy co-chair of the EMCR Forum, which is an early and mid-career researcher forum under the Australian Academy of Science, and I'm the lead on on TFOM, which started as a symposium, and I'll come back to that, but has sort of continued on in this community of practice collaboration form that we're still not quite sure what we are, but we exist, and I'll give you a little bit more insight into that as well. What I've shown on this slide is actually interactions I've had in these various contexts over the last few years, and obviously it has been a lot online. And the online experience has varied in terms of its quality, but I think overall it's been a really positive one for me. So hopefully for those of you attending as well, it's also had some positive elements. Reflecting on some of the last things that I did in 2019. These are all examples of conferences or things that I went to. And I guess one of the points is at the time, which is already showing progress that we've made, none of these actually allowed for hybrid participation. You either had to be there or you weren't. And so I think the fact that we're already seeing conferences start to adapt and meetings and workshops to be more inclusive in a hybrid sense, that's already showing progress. But then if we step back a little bit and we look at how meetings have evolved over the last century or not, I think it's kind of instructive. So one of the, I guess, conversations we've been having in the Future of Meetings context is with historians who have a EU project to study the history and evolution of the scientific conference. I recommend you check them out. They're SciConf. And they've been studying sort of how conferences evolved, how they developed post World War II, and where we got to. And there's actually, that in kind of the 50s, there was a lot of questioning about what made a good conference, and this is how you do it, and this is the point of it. But sort of since then, we've gone to this place where we don't necessarily question as much anymore. And I say that's in general, but there's obviously exceptions. And I saw Sarah was here. I mean, dot astronomy is a great example of one that's been challenging this for many years. There's also things like the Lorentz Center. But in general, we sort of have this accepted conception of what a conference is. And so I think that's, it's something we have the opportunity now to just really rethink and see, why do we get together in the first place? And it's a century old. So it's a good time to think about other formats and think about different ways we can interact. And a bigger question in all of this when we think about sustainability, and I know when you have a giant landmass with many countries and trains that work really well across them, you have the chance to consider overland travel. When you're a continent that's in the middle of the ocean, pretty far from everywhere else, we don't necessarily have the same, I guess, way to get around. And so the question then is, is our old way the only way we can be effective global scientists, or are there other ways we can adopt that allow us to be more connected globally without the need to physically travel as much as we used to? That's not to say we never do again, but we just sort of change how much we're doing it. And also connected to this is the concept of inclusivity. So when we think about how we interact with others and how we design our meetings and how like we bring everyone to the table. Are we doing it in a fair way, or are we sort of designing it so that the people who can't be there are really missing out and creating that two class of experience? And one of the things we've also thought a lot about in the context of the future of meetings is how do we interact when we are physically separated by distance? And can we go beyond sort of the familiar tools like Zoom and WebEx and Teams and start to embrace some of the new upcoming technologies as, we're kind of with mixed reality. We're at the stage where the internet maybe was in the 90s. So it's becoming useful. There's critical mass. It's not there yet, but it's getting there. And it's one of the ways in which, as astronomers, we can sort of embrace these new technologies and start to shape where they go in the future. And then another question is going beyond being there, which is a really interesting thing that was posted, like kind of posed in the 90s by the human computer interaction field, which was so many of the limitations of our technology come from the fact that we focus so much on reproducing physical face-to-face interaction, like we almost at the cost of all else. And we can sometimes miss the opportunities that we'll otherwise have with the technology because we're using it in a different way. And so another thing that's interesting to consider is how, what we do impacts sustainable development in the future. I've seen more and more grants and I guess projects come up that are specifically addressing sustainable development goals, even within academia. And so one of the things that has become clear is, we think about things like the IAU Office for Astronomy for Development, and it's not just astronomy as a topic that can help make the world a better place, which it can, but it's also the way we science that can sort of start to have impact on society. So, the way we collaborate internationally, the way we build teams, the way we function, those are sort of ways we can contribute back to broader society as everyone tries to figure out what to do next post online 2020 onwards. So like I said, the Future of Meetings, it started as a symposium. This was in 2020. Despite the timing, we actually didn't plan it around COVID. We started it in late 2019 because virtual reality was getting pretty advanced. And we were also thinking about the sustainability aspect as one of the key drivers. But we were finalizing the proposal when COVID sort of started to happen, and it was like, oh, okay. So suddenly this broadens to a bigger conversation about the future of work. And it's relevant to many more people who might not have otherwise engaged just from the concept of sustainability, but also just how do we even function as a society. And what we found through that was that, when we brought together this cross-disciplinary group, both for the speakers and the organizing committee, is that we actually made a lot of innovation and progress in a short amount of time, specifically because we emphasized diversity across all of the different elements we could. So that was something that was quite interesting that came out of TFOM. We sort of treated it as a meta experiment. So it was like we were having this conference about, well, it was like a meeting about meetings was the running joke. And then when we had committee meetings, it was like the meetings about the meeting about meetings. So it got a little meta, but we did treat it as an experiment so that we could sort of take what the status of best practice was at the time and feed that into what we produced, at the end, and make sure that we documented everything. We wrote a really long report, an 88-page report that's very comprehensive. So it kind of, if you have any questions about the decisions we made in designing and executing, that probably is in that report. And we've written articles since then. So yeah, there's a number of things. We tried to summarize the key recommendations as DISERV, which we could discuss later, but it was really, I think, taking some of the key lessons we learned in making it and trying to make them high level so people could also benefit from them. And DISERV is just one example. There's lots of things that are coming out that have recommendations. And I would say, it's definitely good to sort of look around if you're in the case of designing your next meeting, conference, event, anything, just look at what kind of templates and recommendations are out there for best practice and then build on them, which is also one of the ways that they improve. So, yeah, so we were asking ourselves a lot, how do we not necessarily go back to normal? Like, obviously, we all miss a lot of the things about the old normal, the nice parts, but how do we sort of take what we learned over the last few years and make a better normal is something that we think about a lot. So in terms of some high-level activities that we've been involved with over the last couple years since TFOM itself, we had a retro planning workshop in 2021, which was mostly TFOM and interested people that kind of got involved in TFOM since the symposium itself. And as part of that, we were thinking, okay, what can we do to sort of further the outcomes and help make a positive difference? So that's one of the things we actually ran. Other than that, we've presented at a number of conferences in many different disciplines. There is a strong astronomy focus because a lot of astronomers were involved with TFOM. And we've also been directly involved in some like specific conferences at various levels, like either taking on all of the technical organization or giving advice and things like that. And that's not an exhaustive list. So to give a couple of examples of things we've done just from how did we approach it, we were asked for advice on the International Conference for Women in Physics, and in the end we helped them to form a technical organizing committee which involved three of us from TFOM leading it, and then we recruited several students who we trained in how to approach the online side of things. And really work with the organizers there to try and figure out what was a good solution that would work well for them. This was a really interesting conference because it has delegations. So there's specific representatives from each country. It's always been in person. There had to be a low barrier of entry because there was variations in access to technology or stable internet. And it was really focused mostly on networking and social, which I know is often one of the things people criticize and say, okay, you can't do that online. So it was, it was one of the challenging things, but it came together really well and had, the highest attendance, the highest attendance from low dynamic, the Human Development Index countries who can't always get the funding to go to these in person. So there are a lot of positives to come out of it. And what was really clear in this context was how exclusive and inaccessible most of our traditional meeting formats are to most countries. There's a distance factor, but there's also a funding factor, there's caring factors, there's all of these different things. And, when it's sort of business as usual, you don't notice it as much. So for me, that's a really big why, is we want science to be accessible to everyone to take part. So we kind of have to find a way forward that is more inclusive than the old way. In the case of Science Pathways, so this is through my role as part of the EMCR forum. So I'm on the executive for that. And for that, we did keep the in-person format. So that's one of the examples of hybrid. We actually did a mixed mode. So we had a hybrid launch day, in-person only workshops and online only workshops and panels and things like that. And throughout that, we did have the in-person element, but we also made sure we minimized the gap in experience in hybrid. And I'll come back to that a little bit later. And what was clear in this, I mean, as kind of everyone knows, is that when you go hybrid, when you have in-person and you have online, you do create two classes of experience. And in fact, if you're doing it right and you're getting people together in person for the right reason, which is social interaction, then there is going to be a gap in that because if you say, okay, I'm going to have everyone together in person, but I'm going to make everyone on their laptops and sort of connecting to online, then the question ultimately becomes, why are they there in person in the first place? So you can acknowledge that gap, but you sort of have to just be mindful of it. And I'll come back to this a little bit in a sec too. And going hybrid is just way better and more acceptable at this age than saying in person only. I think most people worldwide would probably not agree that in person only is the future for anything. Another example of a conference that we've been involved with is Infrared 2022. So this was mostly, I guess, kind of run, and it was completely online as well and done really well. Our role in this was really to work with the organizers to help them run VR sessions. So in virtual reality, which is something that I know most, it's pretty new in astronomy. We haven't seen too many VR events come up yet. So we helped them design some social sessions to take place in AltSpace VR, which is one of the freely available VR tools. As part of that, we were prioritizing there had to be access for people who didn't have a virtual reality headset. And in fact, in TFOM, we really only consider the platforms that allow for that mixed access. So you can do it in a VR headset, but you can also do it from your desktop. And because we're astronomers, or a lot of us are, we tend to also prioritize platforms that also have Mac access, although Linux almost never makes it. So there's just not a lot of support for that. But you can find platforms that do at least do Windows and Mac. And yeah, the goal was really to show this as a tech demo and showcase possibilities. And so there's actually a cool trailer that one of our TFOM people put together, so I can share that after, just to kind of demonstrate what it looked like. And like I said earlier, so mixed reality is not perfect. I would compare it to, like, say, if you think of the early computer games of the 1990s, like Croc or I don't know, or the other ones, Crash Bandicoot, or I mean, they were anyway that sort of style. And you think about where we are with now, that's sort of the gap. But they're getting to be really usable and quite a lot of people, and the interfaces are getting better. So they're definitely worth at this stage exploring and giving a try and seeing if it would work for a particular type of interaction. So, in terms of thinking about in-person interaction, I mean, what we've seen worldwide as restrictions ease and borders open is there's a lot of people kind of rushing to make up for lost time, sometimes for good reasons and sometimes for questionable reasons. And so the question then becomes, okay, well, when do we in person in the future? This is not like a complete list. And I think maybe discussing after would be interesting to hear of other things people are thinking about. But what we've come up with in the TFOM side is for social events and activities. So like say meals, having meals together, barbecues, farewell lunches, welcome lunches, stuff like that. Difficult conversations can be better in person. There's a movie Up in the Air. I don't know who's seen it, but you could go watch that and get a bit of an idea of where I'm going with that. Catch ups and sharing ideas. Like a lot of people talk about hallway conversations. I do often reflect whether the hallway conversation would be, put forward as so critical if it was coming from the employees rather than the institutions. So if, I don't know, maybe offices were all getting demolished and everyone was desperate for hallway conversations, would it be as a priority if we realized how much budget we would save and stuff like that? Anyway, interesting thing. I think hallway conversations are great and I really enjoy the ones I have, but I think there's a place and time for them. And we just sort of have to figure out what that place and time is. The question, there's also if the work requires it. Within CSR, we have a lot of people that are lab-based. We have engineers. We have people that need to come in physically sometimes. That is changing. There's a lot of work being done on automation, autonomy, like robotics, labs of the future sort of stuff. And so, yeah, so I think future of work will sort of shift that a little bit differently too. There's building personal networks, which is, say, if you think of someone starting new for the first time who doesn't have any personal connections with the broader institute, that can be a good reason to say, hey, come in, spend a few days, meet this person, get to know them a bit, and it makes the online remote stuff later easier. Or immersive collaboration. So if you're going somewhere for a really long time just to really get to know an institute or make the most of a really long visit, then that could make sense to do some stuff in person too. And so I guess the key message here is when you are planning for in-person, and this applies to hybrid as well, the question should be, is it worth it for those excluded? So every time we do something in person, we're not going to get everyone. That was true before COVID. That's even more true now with more flexible and hybrid ways of working. So when we insist in person, is it worth it? And I think as long as people ask that question and can say, yes, it is worth it for this reason, then that's already really good progress. So to go to the question of is it worth it? So we don't have the data yet to compare exact conferences, but these are examples in terms of showing what the difference of online to in-person can make. So the left side is example of in-person conference attendance for 2019. And in this case, it's sorted by Human Development Index, which is kind of like GDP, but mixed in with other factors measuring country wealth, all of those sort of things. You can look it up. And what you see is a very systematic and tight correlation between the HDI of a country and how many conference attendees, and this is a log scale, can make it to the conference. The color scale is CO2, so how much carbon emissions were emitted as part of those travels. When you go online, it's not perfect data. We don't have all the data yet. I think if we compiled it worldwide, we'd start to see something more. But what you do see is that correlation starts to spread out, because what becomes more important rather than just the ability to travel freely or with cost is access to technology, access to network, stable internet, those sort of things, which are still not perfect worldwide. And there is a HDI correlation, but it's not as tight and it's not as exclusive. So yeah, and I guess one of the interesting things when we think about, say, the European Astronomical Society, I think it's come up before, was that, we haven't actually seen a huge diversification in the attendance so far, even though the last couple were online. But the other thing to think about is that actually communities take time to diversify. So if you have a historic systemic part exclusion, you don't suddenly get all of the people who are desperate to come the next year. It's a process, and it's something that we have to grow and develop. So in terms of moving on to what does this mean for actually making hybrid work, and And I don't think if I show this picture from spatial, not because I think this is necessarily what hybrid is going to look like, but to some extent, mixed reality is going to change the way we think about this, and the the emphasis on this gap between in person and not will probably change a lot. That's not necessarily the tomorrow solution. The other thing I would say with all of this is that just keep in mind that online only is a really critical tool at your disposal. And there are cases where that is going to be way easier than trying to solve the hybrid problem. And we can discuss that after. So I mentioned science pathways before. I thought I'd give some explicit examples of decisions we made to try and, you know, make that hybrid experience not too bad for all involved. So we did have a conference platform. It doesn't have to be Hoover, but we had something that would unite people regardless of how they were attending. It existed before, during, and after the conference, so it allowed those connections, and that was really important. We had questions all go through that platform, so we didn't have this gap in the online people get to speak, the in-person, sorry, the other way around. The in-person people get to speak, the online people don't, or the complication of trying to get both audiences speaking. We just used the platform. Not always the right choice, but in this case it worked well. We partnered with the University of Melbourne. They're our platinum sponsor, and they did the venue and the AV. And that was important. Like, I mean, I don't think it has to cost tons. Like, I mean, people sometimes think, oh, you've got to pay so much to make it good hybrid. You don't, but you should pay enough that it is a good quality live stream so that you minimize that technical experience, like problems and issues and stuff. We had recordings available immediately after for people who couldn't join live. And that helped people still be part of the conversation, even when time zones or other things were involved. We were completely inclusive, regardless of in-person or remote speaker or participant attendance. We didn't try to segregate people or say you had to be here in person or else, or treat remote as like a backup if you really couldn't be there in person. We wanted all options on the table. And we had an in-person online rep. And what I mean by that is, as the technical lead, I went there in person. I sat in the room with the AV people. I did not sit with the general attendants. And I just attended as if I was an online person, just to make sure if something went wrong, I was aware of it and could act on it really quickly. Another thing to think about when we think about, we do a lot of hybrid meetings where, say, colloquia now, where you have some people in a room and maybe you have a lot of people dialing on online. What I've seen in practice is that not enough thought is given to the AV situation yet. This is an example from not the same colloquium, but two different instances of the same one, where lighting has made a complete difference to the experience. So just small changes, like in this case, I think there was just like this light kind of like stuck in front of Ron's face so you could see him, but that made a huge difference for the ability of the camera to show his expressions and what was happening. So that's a really small change you can make. Another example is, so there are other technologies like this. One of the ones we've used in TFOM is the meeting owl, which, if anyone's following the news, was actually got some bad press recently for some security flaws, which are patched, they assure me. Anyway, there are other things to consider too, but what it is it's like a fisheye camera with a speaker and a microphone, sits in the middle of the room. Sort of acts like those smart cameras that WebEx or Cisco has and zooms in on people, but what it also gives is a panoramic view of the room, and it does dynamic zooming in and stuff in a more organic way, I think, than some of the Cisco tech. We haven't experimented with it super widely because we're still at the stage where, we don't try to gather a lot of people in a physical room unless you really have to. But that's also an example of where some of the new emerging technologies can help make the hybrid experience better. And we'll be doing more tests with this in the future. And another point, so going back to that, online only versus in-person versus hybrid, online formats can go well beyond video calls. Here are just 3 examples of platforms we've used. So Gather, which I know is probably very familiar to people by now, AltSpace, and Glue. And there's a lot more. And I think this is something where there's no perfect one, but if you explore these and you try different tools, sometimes the video call is the best option and sometimes it's not. But using the video call like a hammer to fix all of the problems in the house is probably where most of our problem with online comes right now. And it's really about diversifying the approaches we take. So to kind of give some high-level tips about going hybrid, I think a big question, which maybe is controversial, is hybrid the right format? And I say that meaning that it could be online only. If there are rare cases, I think, where you could justify in-person only and say yes, like, I don't know, a recent example. Well, actually, no, that was hybrid. I was going to say this Science Meets Parliament gala dinner, but they actually did hubs across the country and connected them. So it wasn't entirely in person only. But there are examples, right, where you could think, okay, it's just hybrid doesn't make sense, but they're pretty rare. So if hybrid is the minimum, then the question is, could it be done easier or more effectively or more inclusively if it was just online? It could probably be simpler online. So it depends about that value balance. Um, Considering the experiences of all audiences, that probably sounds common sense, but what we've seen a lot is people still really focus on the in-person experience and the online is a tag on. Sometimes, there's this fly on the wall hybrid, which is really just like a live stream, and sometimes, but not always, the online people are empowered to actually have autonomy in the meeting and sometimes not. So that varies. But yeah, considering the experience for all audiences and trying to give, I guess, that autonomy to all audiences is quite important. It is important to invest some budget in technical capacity. These are things like the AV, making sure there's good quality recordings available fairly quickly, investing in some platforms that can be used. But I actually object strongly to like it doesn't have to cost tens of thousands of dollars, although conference companies might like you to believe that you can do it for a much lower budget, but doing it for zero budget is, probably not ideal. And you wouldn't necessarily run an in-person event for zero budget. So it's sort of that I guess space between. Providing ways to engage asynchronously has been really important. And actually one of the ways where going online or hybrid really is better, I think, than just in person, because so many interactions that I've had at in-person events over the years have just been lost to the sands of time because there was no way to follow up and you just sort of lose momentum. So I think these asynchronous platforms can really help a lot. I love the conference that Peter and I were at where they had Zenodo and we uploaded slides. That's been great. I've already been able to share content and slides with people at Space and Astronomy and they've looked at them. So I think more of that kind of stuff is really valuable. And shifting this mindset from focusing on physical plus online and just thinking about the venue being digital first and everything connects to that, that can be quite a good way to think about hybrid and make things better. Because then if you lose the physical venue for whatever reason, it doesn't matter because your venue is not tied specifically to it. So the question going into this discussion afterwards and questions and stuff, I think, is why not hybrid or online only? And it'd be good to hear about the barriers that people are facing and things that, that you're finding are stopping you or shifting back to in person. Anyways, in conclusion, I guess what we've seen with the future of meetings is that, I mean, we're all trying to like make the world a better place in a small way, right? This is a really cool way that we can actually address a lot of things. We can be more accessible, we can be more inclusive, we can be more sustainable, and all it kind of requires is not necessarily a small thing, but changing our practices to this new normal at all levels. So from the decisions we make on an individual basis to the highest levels of governing institutions and how we run collaborations and interactions. But it does seem like there's so much potential here to do better. And so there's a quote on the left from Glenn Keane. That was a conference I would never go to in person because SIGGRAPH, I'm not a computer graphics person, but because of the new kind of ways that silos are breaking down, so much more is possible now than it was before. So that's really exciting. And I'm looking forward to discussing with you all. Thanks.